King Henry VIII is probably the most fabled and famous of the kings of England. During his long, eventful reign, he demolished the administrative and religious structures of the Middle Ages and moulded for himself a thoroughly modern nation-state. But of course, the colourful and charismatic king is most remembered for his endless matrimonial difficulties. For Henry's failed marriages were to bring about the downfall of no fewer than 5 of his queens and 2 of his most gifted ministers. This, then, is the story of Henry, the King of 6 Wives. Henry was the youngest son of Henry VII, who, with his wife Elizabeth of York, was the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Henry had won the crown of England on the bloody field of Bosworth in 1485, where he had finally defeated the Yorkist Richard III. His son, Henry, was born at Greenwich Palace in 1491. And it was in these pleasant surroundings that the child spent most of his youth. He became Prince of Wales upon the unfortunate death of his elder brother Arthur in 1502. And by the time he finally succeeded to the crown in 1509, England was groaning under the burden of the high taxes imposed by his father. The royal court, after years of rule by a prudent but miserly widower, was in deep depression. And without doubt, the whole country was hungry for a change from the austerity of Henry VII's 24-year reign. The new king's succession was therefore greeted with universal optimism and enthusiasm. The entire country seemed to catch the positive, upbeat mood which accompanied the succession of their handsome, athletic new prince. One of the new king's courtiers, Lord Mountjoy, summed up these joyous feelings in a glowing description of the new monarch.
If you could see how everyone here rejoices in having so great a prince, how his life is all their desire, you would not contain yourself for sheer joy. Extortion is put down, liberality scatters riches with a bountiful hand. Yet our king does not set his heart on gold or jewels, but on virtue, glory, and immortality. The other day he told me, "I wish I were more learned." "But learning is not what we expect of a king," I answered, "merely that he should encourage scholars." "Most certainly," he rejoined, "as without them we would scarcely live at all." Now, what more splendid remark could a prince make?
Sir Thomas More, who was later to serve as Henry's Lord Chancellor, was also filled with enthusiasm for the king. He has a way of making every man feel that he is enjoying his special favour. Just as the London wives pray before the image of Our Lady by the Tower till each of them believes it is smiling upon her. In later years, Sir Thomas would come to feel very differently. A man of the deepest convictions, he would be ordered by Henry to abandon his beliefs as the king pursued his own personal political ambitions. More's refusal to do so would cost him his life. Yet even in these happy, optimistic early years of his reign, Henry was displaying worrying signs of the ruthless, all-powerful autocrat he would later become.
I am content with what I have. I wish only to govern my own subjects. Nevertheless, I will not allow anyone to have it in his power to govern me, nor will I ever suffer it.
The country's delight was further increased by the news that Henry's intended queen was Catherine of Aragon, the popular Spanish princess who had been married to Henry's elder brother Arthur. When Arthur tragically died in the following year, she was immediately betrothed to Henry, the new Prince of Wales, as a means of maintaining an important alliance with Spain. The daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine was an attractive, proud and lively girl who had adjusted easily to the ways of the English court. Now he was king, Henry was keen to consolidate the betrothal to her with a swift marriage. Indeed, the match was not entirely one of convenience, for the love and affection between the young couple was very genuine.
If I were still free, I would choose her for my wife before all others.
The king's happiness was completed when on New Year's Day, 1511, his new wife bore him a seemingly healthy son to be called Henry. The overjoyed king made a pilgrimage of thanksgiving to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham and embarked upon a series of extravagant celebrations which culminated in a 2-day tournament at Westminster. But the joy of the king and queen was to be short-lived. For only 10 days later, the infant prince became ill and died. For Henry, it was a shattering, heart-breaking blow. But after a period of deep and very public mourning, he forced himself to confront affairs of state once more. And there were pressing matters to be considered. For in November 1511, Henry had been invited by King Charles V of Spain and Pope Julius II to form the Holy League against Francis I, King of France. This new alliance would wage war on France, and the profits from the enterprise would be split evenly. Always keen to find ways of filling the royal coffers, Henry enthusiastically agreed to join. And before long, he was leading his country into what could legitimately be described as a holy war. Preparation had been placed in the capable hands of an ambitious cleric named Thomas Wolsey. So successful was he in this work that when Henry returned from the wars, he immediately promoted Wolsey from the almoner to chief minister, an unprecedented and meteoric rise to fame. By October 1515, the king was so taken by the brilliant butcher's son from Ipswich that he wrote to the Pope asking to make Wolsey a cardinal. And within 2 years, Wolsey had been installed in the greatest office in the land, that of Lord High Chancellor. For 15 years thereafter, Henry and Wolsey formed a formidable partnership, ruling England in a ruthlessly efficient manner. It has been noted that the two shared a certain physical resemblance, and they certainly possessed similar personality traits. Both were unscrupulous and avaricious, and completely single-minded in their pursuit of pleasures of the flesh. Although Wolsey was unpopular, he was a gifted, highly intelligent, hard-working and loyal man, unswerving in his devotion to Henry.
Cardinal Wolsey, Thomas Wolsey, was first and foremost a very able minister of state, very, very able diplomat, and an extremely astute politician. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I would say on the whole, he was also a dedicated man, dedicated to what he saw as the good of England as a nation. And he saw the future of England as being great and wanted to steer the country in that direction. He was often accused of being vain, and he was accused of liking pomp and circumstance, which was undoubtedly true. But I think that those aspects of his character are very minor compared to this enormous ability he had, the way in which he was able to negotiate with sometimes hostile foreign powers and smooth over troubled waters. Very much a man who wanted to see a peaceful future and a peaceful transition to that future. The one thing that cost Wolsey his career was the one thing that he failed at, and that was the failure to secure the divorce that Henry so desperately wanted. I think it's fair to say in this context that he was yet another victim to Henry's vanity in this sense, and Henry's desperate desire to get a male heir. Had he not died at Leicester when he was on his way to London, it's very clear that he would have been executed when he reached London. Had, however, he been able to secure the divorce that Henry wanted, it is equally clear that he would have lived his life out in some honour and respect.
During this time, Henry and Catherine's attempts to produce a male heir to the throne had met with bitter disappointments. The death of the infant Prince Henry had been followed in 1513 by the birth of a stillborn son, and by the delivery of a premature boy in the November of the following year. However, the fortunes of the unhappy couple seemed to revive when in February 1516 the Queen was safely delivered of a girl called Mary. But by now, Henry was having serious doubts about Catherine's ability to bear him a prince. What was more, her numerous pregnancies had inevitably taken their toll on Catherine's looks and figure. And Henry's amorous eyes soon began to wander. In 1518, he became embroiled in a passionate affair with a lady called Elizabeth Blount, who, with irony that was bittersweet, bore him a son, whom he called Henry Fitzroy. In 1520 came spectacular respite from Henry's domestic worries, when peace with France was celebrated in characteristic style at an event that became known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Francis I and Henry VIII met to cement their new friendship amid lavish displays on the plain in northern France, thereby entering into an entente cordiale that had seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Gilded palaces were erected, and there followed revelry, feasting and jousting, which lasted for several days. The peace was sealed with the betrothal of the 2-year-old Princess Mary to the young Dauphin of France. In continental Europe, however, religious uncertainty and dissatisfaction smouldered, embodied by the emergence of the German priest Martin Luther, who finally lit the burning fires of Protestantism. King Henry, a good and devout Catholic, was utterly outraged by the new doctrines and ideas which were arousing such heated debate, and set himself up as a champion of the old religion. In 1521, he wrote a famous treatise in Latin, proudly calling it The Defence of the Seven Sacraments. It was certainly a powerful document, in which the king passionately defended the Pope and the embattled Catholic faith. The words contained in the treatise are a testimony to the strength of Henry's feelings.
What serpent so venomously crept in as he who calls the most holy see of Rome Babylon, and the Pope's authority tyranny, and turns the name of the most holy Bishop of Rome into that of Antichrist?
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
However, contained in the document were some very important passages, the irony of which would be brought into ever sharper focus. Did the king ever regret writing these words?
The insipid water of concupiscence is turned by the hidden grace of God into wine of the finest flavour. Whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder.
In Rome, the Pope naturally received Henry's work with unfettered enthusiasm, and was suitably flattered by its verses dedicated to him. In gratitude, he bestowed upon Henry the grand title of Defender of the Faith, a title still carried by the ruling monarch of England to this very day. Despite this surge in the king's fortunes abroad, the royal marriage was now in very serious difficulty. Queen Catherine had been delivered of yet another stillborn girl, And now it seemed the entire nation was becoming increasingly concerned about the succession. Henry was by now absolutely desperate to provide the country with the male heir to the throne it so badly needed. And his frustration with Catherine for her failure to give him what he wanted had now turned into bitter contempt. He had probably already made up his mind to try and divorce Catherine when in 1527 he met and fell in love with Anne Boleyn. Anne was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and had been brought up at the French court, where she had acquired a very comely elegance. A contemporary account of her reported, "Mistress Anne is not one of the handsomest women in the world. She's of middle in stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the English king's appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful." In fact, the lecherous king was first attracted to her elder sister Mary, who was for a time his mistress. But the younger Anne was not so easily won. The ambitious girl had set her sights firmly on the crown. She determined not to yield to Henry's amorous advances unless there was a promise that he would marry her and make her his queen. Over a 6-year period, she tantalized and teased the king until he became utterly obsessed with her. All feelings for Catherine were by now completely forgotten. All the king wanted was Anne. Not that she was without other admirers. The poet Thomas Wyatt, for instance, wrote this lovelorn verse to her. "Who list her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. And graven in diamonds and letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about, Nole me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame." Henry, too, was completely, hopelessly in love, his ardour sharpened by Anne's failure to yield to his advances.
I have been now above 1 whole year stricken with the dart of love. It shall please you to do me the office of a true and loyal mistress and friend, to give yourself up, body and heart, to me, who will be and have been your very loyal servitor. I promise you not only the name that will be owed to you, but also that I will take you for my sole mistress, thrusting all others save you from thought or affection, and to serve you alone.
It is reputed that the king wrote the song Green Sleeves in honour of Anne Boleyn. The love-struck Henry even turned to verse to try and win her love.
Now unto my lady, promise to her I make, from all other only to her I me betake.
And so Henry turned to Cardinal Wolsey to resolve what was to become known as his great matter. In fact, the king had become increasingly disenchanted with Wolsey, a feeling fueled by envy and resentment of the enormous riches Wolsey had accrued over the years. Now came Wolsey's chance to win his master's love and affection once more. He was required to secure a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, on the spurious grounds that because she had been married to the king's brother, the union was incestuous and illegal. This could not be achieved without papal authority. Henry's request was anti-Catholic, completely unprecedented, and highly unlikely to be granted. Wolsey's onerous task was made considerably more difficult for him when the shifting alliances in Europe changed once more as Charles V of Spain, nephew of Queen Catherine, sacked Rome and took the Pope prisoner. In this delicate situation, the pontiff was even more unlikely to annul Catherine's marriage and risk offending his captor. And so, to forestall a decision, a commission was set up to examine the whole issue of the divorce. The men placed in charge of the commission were Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio. Naturally, Wolsey was eager to obey Henry's bidding and win the divorce. But Campeggio dragged his heels, and in July 1523, just when a judgment was expected, he announced that the decision would be postponed until the end of October. Not surprisingly, the king was filled with anger and frustration, and it was the unfortunate Thomas Wolsey who bore the brunt of his terrible temper. For his failure to win Henry his divorce, Wolsey was summarily dismissed as Chancellor and was ordered to retire in disgrace to his archbishopric in York. Unfortunately, Wolsey made the grievous mistake of asking Francis I and Charles V to intercede with the king on his behalf. Henry was livid, and he decided that Wolsey's desperate act was treason. He therefore ordered his erstwhile servant to be arrested and brought to London to face the charge. Wolsey was on his way back to London to stand trial when he died at Leicester, thereby avoiding certain execution. Wolsey's fall from grace had been as spectacular as his rise to power. In July 1531, Henry left Windsor Castle in secret to go hunting with Anne. He would never see his wife Catherine again. She was ordered to move into Wolsey's old house at the Moor in Chelsea, and was forbidden to write to the king or see her daughter, Princess Mary. For the heartbroken queen, a helpless pawn in the high-powered game, the strain was almost too much to bear. She confided to a lady-in-waiting,
"What I suffer is enough to kill 10 men, much more a shattered woman who has done no harm. I am the king's lawful wife, and while I live, I will say no other. At the moor, separated from my husband without having offended him in any way, Catherine, the unhappy queen."
Completely frustrated by the lack of progress with his divorce, but still determined to get his own way, the king's patience with the Pope and the Catholic Church was now wearing paper thin. Indeed, there was a general mood of dissatisfaction with the Church throughout the country, as the people tired of cynical ecclesiastical abuses and injustices. The opportunistic Henry now tapped into the popular mood. After all, had not the Protestant Luther demonstrated there was an alternative to papal authority? For a man who had recently written so passionately in defense of the Catholic doctrines, who had so lavishly praised and lauded the Pope, it was an incredible about-face. But now Henry would stop at nothing to achieve his aims. Although there is no evidence that he intended to break with Rome before 1532, the discovery that Anne Boleyn was pregnant brought matters to a head. The new baby, surely the longed-for boy, must be born within wedlock. And so, on the 25th of January 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married. The dread news was broken to the disbelieving Catherine of Aragon, who was informed by letter that she was no longer queen and that she would revert to her former position of Princess of Wales. It was a final, heartless, unfeeling humiliation for the queen who had maintained throughout her ordeal the greatest dignity. In the May of that year, a special ecclesiastical court was convened at Dunstable under the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a fellow opportunist, and the marriage of the king to Catherine of Aragon was declared null and void. Before very long, Parliament had passed an act restraining appeals to Rome in order to prevent the former queen enlisting the help of the Catholic Church to fight her cause. and almost in one fell swoop, the power of the Pope in England was effectively brought to an end. At last, Henry was free to marry. On May the 29th, 1533, Anne Boleyn was given a splendid coronation, and 4 months later, the new royal child was born. But it was not the bonny prince of King Henry's dreams, for Anne was delivered of a girl, the Princess Elizabeth. Henry could hardly conceal his disappointment. Perhaps he stopped loving Anne the moment Elizabeth was born. Still determined to confirm the break with Rome and to validate his new marriage, the king decided that all his key subjects should take an oath of supremacy in support of his new position. Sir Thomas More, a hugely gifted man and respected figure, had already resigned the chancellorship over the breach with Rome. More's faith would not allow him to compromise his deep Catholic beliefs. When Henry insisted that he take the oath, More steadfastly refused. There now followed one of the most ill-considered and terrible actions of the king's reign. He had More, one of the most learned and brilliant men of the age, brutally put to death. The life of one of England's great men was therefore needlessly sacrificed to the selfish whims of King Henry. Anne Boleyn, already held responsible by the people for the downfall of the popular Catherine of Aragon, was also blamed for Thomas More's death, making her even more unpopular throughout the country. And of course, the new Queen's position was made even more insecure by her continued failure to bear Henry a prince. She had a phantom pregnancy and often gave way to the most furious fits of temper. She was simply not fulfilling Henry's high expectations of her. For Anne, the writing was clearly on the wall. 1536 saw the death of the unhappy Catherine of Aragon, who since her fall from grace had been kept a prisoner by her former husband. Her sad words reflected the poignancy of her situation.
My lord and dear husband, I commend me unto you. The hour of my death draweth fast on, and my case being such, the tender love I owe you forceth me to put you in remembrance of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care and tendering of your body, for which you have cast me into so many miseries, and yourself into many cares. For my part, I do pardon you all. Yea, I do wish and devoutly pray God that he will also pardon you. For the rest, I commend you unto Mary, our daughter, beseeching you to be a good father unto her, as I heretofore desired. Lastly, I do vow that my eyes desire you above all things.
Although by the autumn of 1536 Anne Boleyn was pregnant again, time was already running out for her. For Henry had met and fallen in love with Jane Seymour, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. The court quickly became aware of the king's feelings for Jane, and the rumours and gossip could hardly fail to reach Anne. Henry had long since fallen out of love with his queen, and he no longer cared to conceal his feelings from her. In 1536, Henry was seriously injured at a jousting tournament. On hearing the news, Queen Anne, who was pregnant, went into shock and subsequently miscarried. The loss of the baby effectively sealed her fate. Henry immediately commissioned her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and his most trusted minister, Thomas Cromwell, to engineer the Queen's downfall, so that he might marry Jane, his new love. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour was putting pressure on her royal suitor, withholding her favours until she was certain of obtaining the crown. On one occasion, Henry sent Lord Mountjoy with a gift of money. but she merely kissed the accompanying letter and then handed it back unopened to him. Falling to her knees, she asked him to assure the king on her behalf that she was a prudent gentlewoman of good and honourable family, a woman without reproach, who had no greater treasure in this world than her honour, which she would not harm for 1,000 deaths. She ended by saying that if the king wanted to send her money,
I pray him to do so when God might find me a husband to marry.
the Duke of Norfolk and the new chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, were ruthless and thorough in their work. They accused Anne of having had affairs with no less than 5 of her courtiers, amongst them her brother, Lord Rochford. In due course, a confession was obtained by torture from Mark Smeaton, a musician, confirming the suspicions of Norfolk and Cromwell. And 3 days after her supposed lovers had been convicted of adultery with her, the Queen was brought to trial. Accused of plotting the king's death by promising to marry one of her paramours, she was virtually condemned before the trial began. However, Anne accepted her fate in a manner befitting a queen.
I do not say I have always shown him that humility which his goodness to me merited. I confess I have had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion enough and wisdom to conceal. But God knows and is my witness that I have not sinned against him in any other way. Think not I say this in the hope to prolong my life. God hath taught me how to die, and he will strengthen my faith. As for my brother and those others who are unjustly condemned, I would willingly suffer many deaths to deliver them. But since I see it pleases the king, I shall willingly accompany them in death with this assurance, that I shall live an endless life with them in peace.
Queen Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London in May 1536. Although Anne was dead, the reformation of the Church of England, which she had indirectly set in motion, was continuing apace. A survey of the wealth of the Church, known as Valor Ecclesiasticus, was carried out between 1534 and 1535. It revealed what rich pickings there were to be had. The following year, Parliament abolished all small religious foundations whose net income was less than £200 annually. All their lands and treasures were to revert to the king. The dissolution of the monasteries began a revolution that affected ecclesiastic life, the structure of society, and even the appearance of the landscape, as abbeys and nunneries, monasteries and priories were pillaged. Their inhabitants were thrown onto the streets and the buildings themselves left in ruins.
Well, the dissolution of the monasteries has a fairly straightforward rationale behind it. The most obvious reason that Henry wanted to dissolve the monasteries was to gain money. Despite his income of something around £100,000 a year, he needed money in order to finance adventures in Europe and so on, wars. And that's the reason that is always quoted. It was simply a grab for land. But there is a more political reason for the dissolution of the monasteries, and that was a long-standing rivalry between the papacy and the monarchy, both not only in this country but throughout Europe, as to who it was that ran the country. And this rivalry was continuous and very keenly felt by Henry, notwithstanding his other problems around marriage. So by dissolving the monasteries, he killed 2 birds with 1 stone, as it were. He got extra income, extra lands which he could either keep for himself or give to his favourites. But he also weakened the church, and that was a very important consideration. Now, the dissolution actually took place in 2 phases. There was the dissolution of the smaller monasteries, and then a later dissolution of the larger monasteries. In the earlier phases, the members of the convents and the nunneries and the monasteries and so on were given choices. They could pursue their vocation elsewhere, they could retire with pensions and so on. The later dissolution tended to be somewhat more brutal. and people, or members of the church, were ejected without a lot of choice as to where they went.
At the end of May 1536, less than 1 month after the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry took Jane Seymour as his new wife and queen. Her place in Henry's heart was secured when, on the 12th of October 1537, she was delivered of a healthy son after a severe labour that lasted more than 3 days and nights. However, she was well enough at first to write proudly to Thomas Cromwell,
"We be delivered and brought in childbed of a prince, conceived in most lawful matrimony between the Lord, the King's Majesty, and us."
But within a few days, she was showing signs of illness, probably puerperal fever. And less than a fortnight after the birth of Prince Edward, Jane Seymour died. Henry is reputed to have loved Jane above all his wives, and he was genuinely heartbroken by her death. In later years, he asked that his own coffin should be laid next to hers upon his own death, proving his affection for the mother of his only son. However, with plague and pox rife throughout the country, the king did not feel he could rest easy with only one son, and so he decided to look for another bride. In view of his recent history, it was hardly surprising that many eligible young women were less than eager to put themselves forward. In any case, the king's policy at home was the main determining factor upon his choice of any future wife. The success of the dissolution of the monasteries had paved the way for the breakup of larger and larger establishments. It was not surprising that Catholic monarchs abroad were incensed by Henry's actions. And on the 18th of June, 1538, Charles V of Spain and Francis I of France signed a truce, committing themselves jointly to the repression of Protestant heresies. At the same time, Pope Paul III issued a bull excommunicating Henry and absolving his subjects of their allegiance to him. As a result of these new exterior pressures, the king found himself in urgent need of strong, reliable Protestant allies. And so a marriage with a German princess was deemed the most favourable option. To help the king make his choice, the artist Hans Holbein was commissioned to paint likenesses of various German noblewomen. This was certainly not a task Henry found difficult, and as he sifted through the various possibilities, he fell in love with Holbein's miniature portrait of Anne of Cleves. Sadly, the artist had almost certainly exaggerated the Teutonic charms of the German princess. Already in love with her image, Henry set his heart upon the match, and in September 1539, a marriage treaty was signed. However, when Henry was finally introduced to Anne, he could not conceal his bitter disappointment, or his intense anger, for he felt that he had been misled and humiliated.
I see nothing in this woman as men report of her, and I marvel that wise men should make such reports of her as they have done. If I had known as much as I know now, she should never have come into this realm.
The king is said to have referred to his new bride as the Flanders mare. And it is famously rumoured that after their wedding, the king played cards with her all night to avoid any intimacy. This story may be apocryphal, but it accurately sums up the king's feelings towards his new queen. Anne was needlessly humiliated, for Henry simply could not be bothered to conceal his contempt.
By her breasts and belly she should be no maid, which, when I felt them, struck me so to the heart that I have neither will nor courage to the rest.
The hapless Anne, alone and unwanted in a foreign country, quickly became an isolated, unhappy figure. She could hardly fail to be hurt by the coldness of her new husband, despite the fact that the marriage was originally born of political necessity. She confided to a lady-in-waiting.
When he comes to bed, he kisses me, and taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me, Good night, sweetheart. And in the morning he kisses me and biddeth me, Farewell, darling. Is not this enough?
The architect of the disastrous match between Henry and Anne had been Thomas Cromwell, the chief minister, who up until then had been the king's most trusted advisor. Born in 1485 at Putney, Cromwell was the son of a smith and fuller, and had risen through the ranks in the service of Cardinal Wolsey. While men such as Sir Thomas More were prevented by their conscience from helping the king to obtain his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, it was Cromwell who had finally achieved it. It was also Cromwell who had engineered the break with Rome and masterminded the dissolution of the monasteries. He had taken the medieval system of government and had shaken it to its roots, thereby transforming it into an administration far more suited to a modern national state. Although Cromwell gained a reputation as a heartless schemer, he was certainly no more cruel than other powerful men of the Tudor age. But in spite of his undeniably great achievements, ridding his master of the Flanders mare was to prove too much for him. Thomas Cromwell was to join the long list of brilliant men who went to the block just to please the increasingly irrational Henry.
Well, Thomas Cromwell, like his namesake Oliver Cromwell, has, I think, been much maligned in history. There is no doubt about it, he could be ruthless, and he was also ambitious. But like his erstwhile employer, Cardinal Wolsey, he came from fairly humble origins. He rose to great power, and he was a very, very able administrator. Indeed, I think that in some ways Thomas Cromwell was one of the ablest ministers that this country has ever had. He was an astute politician, a clever lawyer, and again, he was dedicated. People have accused him somewhat of being a cynic, but I think he was dedicated, like Wolsey, to a great future for England. As with Cardinal Wolsey, the one great failure in his career is the one thing that finished him off, and that is the negotiation for the marriage contract with Anne of Cleves. Henry said to Cromwell, "I like her not," and in a way that sealed Cromwell's doom. He died on the block, and Henry, having turned his back on him, no longer interested in his fate.
The king's burning desire to be free of Anne of Cleves had been inflamed still further by the young and nubile Catherine Howard, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, whose considerable physical charms had attracted his attention at court. Like her cousin Anne Boleyn before her, she was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. And although Henry was now an aging, obese hulk, sick with an ulcerous leg, he soon determined to have her for his fifth wife. Perhaps Catherine awakened in Henry fast-fading memories of a long-lost youth. Perhaps it was simply that Catherine was everything Anne of Cleves was not. In July 1540, Henry divorced Anne of Cleves and married Catherine Howard. As usual, by hook or by crook, by fair means or foul, he had got what he wanted. He was rid of Anne and had wed an attractive, vivacious young wife. Unfortunately for Henry and also for Catherine, the king's latest marriage was not to work out in quite the way he had planned. It was not long before the almost comical mismatch hit problems.
Essentially, Catherine Howard was just a young girl. She was roughly 21 when she married Henry, and he was 48 at that time, probably as old as her parents. She had the outlook of a young girl. She had the interests of a young girl. There is a story that Henry bored her. I don't know if that's true or not. It might be apocryphal. But certainly she had her eye open for the young men about her and was very easily distracted by any young man that showed her any interest whatsoever. It's certainly true that she was indiscreet in her earlier years. And by here we're talking about 18 or 19. And there is at least a suspicion that she had had sex with one of her suitors earlier on. This has never been proven, but the suspicion was very clear. Certainly she had a lot of earlier liaisons with young men, and these were very well known. After she became queen, unfortunately for her, she continued to have liaisons with other young men, notably Culpeper is one of the characters that came in, a shadowy figure, shadowy in the sense that it's thought that his intentions were not altogether honourable. He was trying to further his own career. But again, she was very indiscreet, and people knew about her liaisons, and inevitably Henry got to hear about them. Once he did hear about them, of course, his vanity again intruded. I think he was insulted by the idea that his wife was not a virgin when she married him, that she could look upon other men. And again, her fate was ultimately sealed once the news was given to him. And she died on the block, I think, accused of illegal intercourse. Because, of course, to have liaisons with the Queen of England was high treason. And in a sense, she committed high treason herself by having those relations.
Catherine Howard finally went to the block on the 13th of February 1542, and the bloated, sick, disillusioned Henry submerged his grief and humiliation by burying himself in foreign affairs. His armies roundly defeated the Scots under James V at Solway Moss, a victory which lifted Henry's spirits, and he concluded a treaty against France with Charles V of Spain. All of which frantic activity left Henry feeling secure enough to contemplate seeking his sixth wife. The woman upon whom Henry's eye lighted was the 31-year-old Catherine Parr, who was married to an elderly invalid, Lord Latimer. In the Tudor age, it was most unusual for married women to receive gifts from other men. But there are records of Henry ordering gowns in the Italian style for her, and sending her presents of pleats and sleeves, which she could not but accept. When Latimer eventually had the good grace to die, Henry was obliged to wait for a decent period of mourning to elapse before wooing Catherine again. Another suitor, Sir Thomas Seymour, whom Catherine genuinely loved, was forced to stand aside. In fact, the king was so jealous of Seymour, the brother of his third wife Jane, that he sent him to the court of the Regent of the Netherlands in Brussels to get him out of the way. By 1543, Henry was a sad and lonely old man. He was attracted to Catherine Parr mainly because she was the antithesis of her predecessors. Virtuous, intellectually able, and a good conversationalist. Catherine was also accomplished in Greek and Latin. Henry obviously believed that she would make an agreeable nurse and companion in his old age, and be a fine stepmother to his children.
A good thing it is when women become such clerks,
Henry opined.
and a thing much to my comfort to come in mine old days to be taught by my wife.
And so, in July 1543, the couple celebrated their marriage at Hampton Court Chapel, and Catherine Parr became Henry's sixth and last queen. As Henry's health worsened and his death became a probability rather than a possibility, jockeying for position at court increased. The strongest contender for power emerged in the form of Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford, the uncle of Prince Edward, and he was named as one of 4 councillors of regency for the young Prince Edward in Henry VIII's will. Henry VIII drew his last breath at St. James's Palace in London on January the 28th, 1547, and the great Tudor icon, a king in the grand manner, was finally gone. At his bedside to comfort him in his final moments was Archbishop Cranmer, perhaps the only surviving friend and servant from the halcyon days of the early 1530s. The old king, who had once seemed so indestructible, had lived to be 55 years of age, and his monumental reign had lasted for nearly 38 years.
It's very difficult to say what Henry's legacy was. He was a large character in all senses of the word. He was a very colourful character, but I think ultimately as a man he was superficial, he was vain, he was spoilt, he was arrogant, and he was ruthless. The good that came out of his reign, I think, occurred almost despite him. He had the two able ministers, Wolsey and Cromwell, both of whom achieved far more than Henry VIII himself ever achieved. They did it at his behest, but really Henry's motives were purely selfish, either for his own interests or in pursuit of the future of the Tudor dynasty. I don't believe that Henry was that committed to the future of the country as a whole, whereas his ministers certainly were. So the good that did come out of Henry's reign, I think, really can be attributed to other people. The fact that this is a Protestant country is almost accidental in terms of Henry's reign. I mean, it's often said that Henry established a Protestant church in this country. He didn't. He established the Church of England with himself at the head, and I think that was a form of vanity, but also it enabled him to pursue his own interests again. The fact that ultimately this became a Protestant church was very much despite Henry. Later on in his reign, he actively pursued Protestant heretics and still saw himself as a Catholic. So I'd say all of the things that have been attributed to Henry really have been attributed unfairly. I don't think as a man Henry himself contributed anything at all. I think it was the people around him that contributed to the good of the country, and it's the people around him who, as it were, engineered the path that the future was going to take. And as I say again, particularly Wolsey and Cromwell.
So ended the reign of England's most colourful and controversial monarch. Catherine Parr, the queen who outlived him, eventually married her former suitor Thomas Seymour, but died in childbirth the following year. The Tudor line was carried on by Edward VI, Henry's son, a weak, sickly but determined child who would live to be only 16 years of age. In the final analysis, Henry had got his dearest wish. A male heir had succeeded to his throne. It was for this that the country had seen the enormous changes and incredible upheaval of the early years of his reign. But to popular English history, Henry VIII will always be the king of 6 wives. To this very day, school children still recite the rhyme which tells of their fate. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived.